Hello, everybody. We're going to be continuing where we left off last time, which was we were working on our Microsoft tutorial, and we are, if you can see my screen here, we are still working on Unit 5, the MVC chapter. What we did last time is we got through these first two bullets of building an MVC app, and we completed the view, and we are about to go into these last two sections, and we had to stop because we ran out of time. So my goal in this video is to complete those two bullets for the tutorial part one. And then time permitting, I'm going to move on to part two and get as much of that done, if not all of it, before I leave here tonight. That'll be a separate video though, so I think it makes more sense to do it that way. So I'm going to be following this link here. That should be linked up in the YouTube description down below for those of you YouTubing this. So let's get started. I do have Visual Studio up and running. This was the app that we were building, so I'm just opening it back up. It's been a solid week since we worked on this. All right, so you can see it opening up here inside of Visual Studio. And I'm going to go ahead and get to the web page with the instructions, which is right here. So this is where we basically left off. So if you're watching the previous video, we ended here and we were about to go to this section here. And so let's just pick up here. We'll read the author's content as much as is pertinent to what we're doing, but our goal here is to get the tasks done and to get everything to work ideally. All right. So the point in this one is that looks like we're going to add a data model. Something we've done before. We're going to work with the NuGet packages. We're going to do some scaffolding, and we're going to do some database migration stuff also. All right. So now, if you guys worked on the previous tutorial that we did, where we did this without MVC, we still use the data model, and so this is not really different from that, right? Because we're still applying that approach, but now we're going to use it more of the MVC fashion, which is where it all comes from. Now, it says right here in the second paragraph, these model classes are used with the Entity Framework Core, which is kind of Microsoft's tool for basically allowing you to take data models and map them to real databases. And it changes the way that you basically write the code. It makes coding simpler in essence. They also point out here that model classes created are known as POCO classes from plain old CLR objects, and they don't have any dependency on Entity Framework Core, but they are basically used just to define the properties of the data that we put into the database. It says in this tutorial, the model classes are created first and the Entity Framework Core creates the database. And that's the migration piece, by the way. All right, so now we're going to go into our app, and I'm assuming that you have the app open from the previous tutorial at this point. And it wants us to add a model, basically. And so we're going to right click the models folder, add a class, and name it movie.cs. Notice the capital M. So let's do that. So I'm going to go right to the models folder, right click, do an add, and then we're going to add a new class file. And class should be listed here. For any reason it's not, I'm not sure why it wouldn't be. Just go to new item and find a C# class to add. They did want us to name this movie.cs. And it is important that you get this correct if you want to use Microsoft's code in a copy paste fashion. If you name stuff differently, of course, you have to make adjustments all along the way. My preference is to match up exactly. So go ahead and add, and then inside that folder now you will see that movie.cs file. Now, one of the tasks that we will have is to add this content. So we do, probably the easiest way to do it, honestly, is just to copy the whole darn file and just overwrite what's there. Once again, provided that everything is named exactly the same. So here we are pasting it in. So you can see the namespace there is declared. I think that, and actually this is probably a pretty notable thing to talk about. I want you to notice here in the auto-generated file how the namespace is set up. Okay, so like in other words, we're calling out a namespace, we're naming it MVC movie.models, and then inside of that namespace, we're creating the class for movie. And there's a set of curly brackets like you do with most standard curly bracketed code, and this is really the proper way to do namespacing inside of an application. When we paste in the code for Microsoft, notice that they're shortcutting it a little bit, right? They're still providing a namespace, but they're terminating with a semicolon and eliminating the curly brackets. Okay, why? I'm not really sure. Either approach would work though. Just keep that in mind. We're copying their code, so this is obviously an approach that's valid. Is the other thing that we're learning. So you can declare a namespace and then not have to nest everything inside of it. And that might make your coding a little bit smoother. I could see that as being useful. There's also a using statement here, and then this looks basically identically like the class file that we set up for the previous application, which was also a movie database. So we have an ID for the movie, a title. Notice the question mark that denotes an optional, basically. We have a date time where we're getting the release date. We're not really worried about the time piece. We have a genre and a price. The price is a decimal. We have a couple strings in there, a date time and an integer. So a mix of data types. And in true C# fashion, they just have a get and a set inside of curly brackets, and the rest is implied. So you don't have to write out all these complicated statements. Very efficient. But that's basically our data model here in this file. Now they do talk a little bit about the data fields here, kind of assuming that maybe you didn't do this previously, but they're talking about the ID field, and we need to have some sort of a field in every database table that we can use to generate the primary key. So what a lot of database designers end up doing is they just create, an ID field, right? That really possibly has nothing to do with the rest of the data, but to be able to identify that particular record in the database uniquely, right? That would be the thinking. So pretty normal just to add an ID field to a table, even if it's not a relevant ID. There's also the data type on release date, right, where we were working with date time, and we've talked about that before. And it is basically a date time type of object, but it has basically an annotation that we're adding, and that's the square bracketed code above. So this is an annotation that talks about like basically how we're pulling these on. So we're pulling this date time object, but we are only using the date piece of it, not the time. And we're not having it auto-generated. This is something that's going to be manually entered, but the format that we're using is date. So, month, day, and year. Next, we're going to work with some NuGet packages here. So the thing about NuGet, and so those of you that are watching this cold, right, not part of the class, that's a tool that we have inside of Visual Studio that allows us to install APIs, basically, is a really good way, or libraries or frameworks or whatever we need that are prepackaged tools and their assets, and add them quickly and easily to a project and do it correctly with the right version numbers and all that. So we will add packages, but notice that it says Visual Studio automatically installs the required packages. So like in the past, in some cases, we have to go in there, find the package we needed, install it, choose the right version, then it's part of the project. What they're telling us here is that just part of the build process is really going to add those packages automatically. All right, so we'll see if that happens, but we'll find out here in a second. All right, so now we're going to do scaffolding again. And the point of scaffolding, of course, is to build all the tools that we need to interface with the database, the basic CRUD operations that you see detailed here, which is create, read, update, and delete data in the database based upon the model of the movie that we created. So it says in Solution Explorer, right-click the controllers folder and select Add New Scaffolded Items. So let's follow those procedures here. And that was on the controllers folder. Right, and you can see that that's on the quick menu. So, all right, so we chose that. And then they want us to choose MVC controller with views using entity framework. And that would be this entry here. All right, it says in the left pane, select installed common MVC. So basically they're just giving us the pathway to it, but we're already there, right? As long as you find the correct one. Ultimately, we're going to click add here. So let's just go ahead and do that. And it brings up this dialog here so that we can kind of generate the next steps. Right. It says in the model class dropdown, select movie, MVC movie models. So let's do that. It should be our only, or one of our few choices. Right, so movie, MVC movie models. And the data context, it says select the plus sign and then the add data context dialog, the class name, MVC movie data, MVC movie context is generated. Okay, so let's see if that happens. Plus sign there, and it is auto-generated bidding out based on the structure of what we already have. So it doesn't come from thin air, but that is the correct code. The database provider for this would be SQL Server. So we're using the internal SQL Server attached to Visual Studio. And then let's check the check boxes here too. They're all checked. The controller name is movies controller. Notice the plurality of it, right? So that it moved from the model class, which is singular, to the controller, which is plural. Once you have all those selections made, go ahead and click add. So you go ahead and click that. You'll notice in the little dialog, installing NuGet packages. This may take a few moments. And what is it installing? It is installing the entity framework because we made that selection in the scaffolding that we're using entity framework. So it's building those packages in. So basically they're all the Microsoft tools for interacting with the database with SQL Server using that library. All right. You can see a whole bunch of stuff was added here. First of all, there was a movies controller file added. Right, so if you want to take a look at that really quick, that's the one that we see up on the screen, and you see how that's all built out. That is, in essence, another controller, and it has a bunch of actions already attached to it automatically. And what are those actions? Those are the actions that are relative to the CRUD operations, right? So those are what it automatically generated. The other thing that we would look at too is this context class for the movie, right? This is allowing us to kind of basically interface the data with the model. Simplistic way to kind of see it. I don't know if you are also seeing this down here, but there's another folder called movies that's got to create, delete, details, edit, and index. And these are all CSHTML files, right? So like, for example, if I was doing a create, and notice the razor syntax here, it gives us the content that goes on the page when we click the create button. So it gives us the HTML forms to drop stuff into. Everything's linked up with ASP tags here. And then ultimately, it kind of handles all of that for us automatically. The same is true for delete, details, edit, and index. Right? And these are all pre-built, let's call them partial pages that are being injected into the main content of the website. Right. Now, we didn't get an error message, which is great, and hopefully you didn't. It goes through and it tells us what it actually does. So it adds the following packages. Now, the packages would be the NuGet packages. So it adds the entity framework core for SQL Server, the tools, and then the Visual Studio Web Code Generation Design tool, right? So that allows it to scaffold, basically. The scaffolding itself creates the following, right? And we saw this in the controllers folder, the movies controller. It creates razor view files. So that, I guess that's the formal name for those cs.html files for create, delete, edit, and index pages. And those are in their own folder also. And a database context class, once again, kind of the intermediary between the model and the data as it feeds through the application. It also said that scaffolding updates the following. It inserts required package references in the project file that we didn't look at. It registers the database context in the program CS file and adds a database connection string to the app settings JSON file. Now, I do think it's worthy of just taking a quick look at those. Most of those are going to be down here in the root. Well, here's the program file, so we can look at that. And somewhere in here, you can see that it has it's adding the database context. I'm trying not to hover to get those pop-ups. And you can see that it's pointing to SQL Server. It throws an exception if it's not connecting. It's trying to use the connection string that is set somewhere else. We do have the app settings.json file, and this is the connection string to the database. These are the kind of the cryptic settings that allow you to actually talk back and forth to the database. And notice that it is a local database, meaning internal to the product. If you were connecting to a remote one, right, which you might do in production mode, you would have a different connection string when you connect to a live database. And then there was one more file, and it was the MS project file, and I'm not really sure where that one is. Not really a big deal if we find it or not, but we are going to move forward here. It might actually be probably in the root, and I have too many things expanded. Anyhow, let's not worry about that too much. It's not really all that critical. It's just kind of nice to see like what is added. So it's in the project file, so it's in the root basically. It's here. This is the project file, and it shows all the assets, and notice the calls to Entity Framework Core. So when you are adding, you get packages. The references for those packages are here, which creates basically, think of it as a list of dependencies, right? So like if you try to spin this up somewhere else, it's like, hey, don't forget you need this and this and this and this. This is how we built it, so you need those things present. All right, moving forward. Right. Let's give us a little heads up here, and it says the scaffolded pages can't be used yet because the database doesn't exist. Running the app and selecting the movie app link results in a cannot open database or no such table movie error message, and and it says build the app to verify there are no errors. All right, so let's actually do that. Let's build it and run it. But any of the pages that are scaffolded, so you think about which pages were scaffolded, all of these razor views were scaffolded, right? We just want to see if it launches and runs. We are going to do a control F5 to launch. That's to launch without debugging. All right, so web server's up and running. I'm just waiting for my browser to respond, and it is up. And then if I look down here in the console, I see no errors or console errors or red underlines anywhere, which is fantastic. I am going to go ahead and close the browser tab, at least for right now. All right. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the first migration on the database. And just to kind of reiterate the concept, the migration is basically a way that we build database components based on the models that we have. So in other words, we're using, I think of it as a code first approach to building a database. So instead of like going into a database product, writing some queries or, using whatever tools the database tool has to build the tables, the database, the joins and all the stuff that a database has, we are instead writing a model class and then issuing a command that then looks at the model class and goes, oh, this model of the data indicates that we should build a table that looks like this. and then it writes the code to build the table and builds the database, right? So that's what the migration is. All right, so we are going to go to the console inside of Visual Studio at this point. So from the tools menu, select NuGet Package Manager console. So we're going to bring up the command line. So tools menu, NuGet Package Manager console, and there's the console down here at the bottom. And I do have it, kind of zoomed in a little bit so we can see it, right? So that's what it kind of looks like. We are given very specific commands to add. I'm going to add them one at a time. And the first command is add a migration. So in other words, we are going to go ahead and let it do its magic, right, to kind of generate stuff. And then add migration is actually the command. Initial create is what we're naming the first migration. Because sometimes what happens when you do this stuff is like, oh, hey, we built our data model, we did a migration, the table was built, and then you're like, oh, but we forgot a field, or wait, we have a few too many. And then what you do is you run the migration again to fix the database. But this is our initial create, and we're naming it. One habit I would often get into when I would do this, especially with Ruby on Rails, is I would date timestamp them in the name. So I would maybe put like today is July 15, 2024. I might say like 7/15/24 and maybe the time or something, you know what I mean? It's still timestamp, but it's just easier to track stuff down. Like, oh yeah, I did that Friday night. For me, that's easier. But I'm just going to go with the name, initial create. All right, you can see it goes through. It gave us a little bit of information, right? And the yellow stuff is not anything to worry about. Because basically it says build started, build succeeded, it did work. And then notice that they do have the option down here at the bottom that, hey, you changed your mind, you can remove this. You can just type that command. All right, the next command is then to take that migration or like the build information for the database and then actually update it into the database and actually make the database do it. Right, so here comes the update command. And once again, you can see that went into. Now, even more interesting, like right, if you get into the geekiness of this, you can take a look at this console and read back through, and it tells you, what SQL commands it actually used, right, for SQL Server. And this is Microsoft SQL Server commands, right, which are slightly different than like MS or MySQL, excuse me. So it has all that information is basically encoded in there. But ultimately, this is the table that we're creating in the database. So we're creating a database, and then we're creating a table in the database and everything that goes with it. So that, I think, was successful. They go through and they explain here what actually happens. Now, remember I was talking about time stamping these, and this is the difference between like the old technology I used, which was Ruby on Rails. That one also timestamped, but I wasn't like I was very crazy about how it did it. Same is kind of true here. It gets a little cryptic, but it is timestamped in the migration file name. So right, it is timestamped. All right. Right, they tell you to ignore the little warnings that you're getting during the running of those commands because they're not fatal. Basically, it still works. But they talk about why. If you're curious, just read up on that there. So now we're gonna run the app and select the movie app link. And they're saying that if you get an exception, you may have missed the update database command. Okay, so I don't think that we're going to get that, but let's try. Okay, so let's go back. Let's do a control F5 and see how fast it launched this time. And then what was the ask was select the movie app link, which is up here. And then you see now we're looking at one of the Razor pages, right? And this is the just listing, and once again, this is very similar to the other app that we did it looks pretty much the same, but the way the technology works underneath is different, right? Same uh, underpinning though. Okay, next step. All right, so here it says examine the generated database context class in registration. And it says data access is performed using a model, and it's made up of entity classes and a context object that represents a session with the database. And I think that's an important piece there, right? So in other words, it's session tracking. The context object allows querying and saving data. The database context is derived from entity framework, basically, and specifies the entities to include in the data model. So they go through and they talk once again about the context class, and they show you the file, right, and the code that goes with it. And it says the preceding code creates a DB set movie property that represents the movies in the database. All right, so that is symbolic, right, of each movie. It becomes kind of like an object in itself. Right, then there's this thing here, the dependency injection, and it says ASP.NET Core is built with dependency injection. It says services such as the database context are registered with the DI in the program CS, and these services are provided that require them via construction or constructor parameters. All right, so in other words, in the controller file, the constructor uses dependency injection to inject that context database into the controller, and then the database context is used in each of the CRUD methods in the controller. So in other words, we create an object in memory, and then we're moving it around in the application to interface with the CRUD pieces. All right, so scaffolding generated the following highlighted code in program CS. So let's go take a look at that, the builder thing. And I think we looked at that already, but let's go back and look at it again. So they're talking about this piece here, right, that I'm highlighting right now. Right, and once again, they're making the same point I did before, that it's basically using the connection string piece there to ultimately talk with the database. We did this piece too. All right, so like you can say it was like maybe like racing ahead a little bit automatically in my brain. But when we look at the app settings.json file, the actual connection string for the database is in there. And this like gobbledygooky stuff here that is going to probably be unique for every app that you build and every machine that you're working on, by the way. And it says for local development, it reads the connection string. Okay, so it does read it from the same place if we're working locally or remotely. If we then switch later to a live database, and that's a really common kind of thing. If we don't have to migrate and the data is already there, we're just attaching to it, it's a little bit different than if we're migrating it. But it would also not be unusual that if you went into production mode to do the migrations, so like you move it to the live server, do the migrations of the database to create all the stuff, maybe even seed it with data. We talked about that and did that a little bit last time, and then roll forward with your app. They do want us to look at the migration files and look at the content of it. So let's just do that real quickly, just so to get familiar with it. Notice the migration folders, and then here's the initial create, and notice 2024 7 etc. It shows you the date and time this was created, and you can see the file and what it did. And notice the code that it's executing, and then how it's in, and then the code that it's using basically to inject the SQL, into the database using C# to generate it. So this is what's going on here. And if you've done any database work, all this terminology is familiar, by the way. They talk about where we set the primary key. And then this gives us a way to undo, and not that title there, but just this part gives a way to basically undo the migration piece if we need. All right. Next, we look at the dependency injection in the controller. And it says open the controller's movie controller CS file and examine the constructor. And the constructor is the one that's named the same as the class file. And this is really kind of an interesting syntax. Let's just go ahead and take a look at that. So this is controllers, movie controller, and then once again, the constructor, right? So this is our constructor function right here. All right, so now it's telling us test the create page, enter and submit data, and then test edit, details, and delete pages. So we need to do those steps. This is what my next little goal is here. So let's go ahead and get to the browser again. The app is still running, so let's create something new. And now we were doing this in our other app, so we have some like movie titles and stuff in mind from what we did last time. So I think we did Star Wars, and we speculated on dates, but I think ultimately we got kind of close. Maybe it was like 1977. We'll call it science fiction. Price, I don't know, $24.99. Let's create a couple. Right, so let's do Toy Story. Once again, I don't really know the date on this, so 1994 maybe. We'll just call this animated, and the price on this would be $29.99. So we'll create it. What if we want to do an edit? So now that we have some stuff here, I can click on edit, and let's say maybe it came out on the 22nd or 21st of June, and the price was $29.95. Turn my num lock on here. We're going to save that, and you see the changes are made. We can also go into the details, which just shows it. And then let's create another like junk movie, like, I don't know, something goofy like that. I have no idea when it came out. Just call that action and make it a very affordable price. Then we'll go, you know what? I don't want this movie on here, so let's go ahead and delete. We have confirmation here, and it's gone. Now, once again, like we saw in the previous app that we did with MVC, because we are creating a database, updating the model and migrating it all and building it into SQL Server. Our CRUD operations are working, so we can see the stuff in the database if we want to. But right now we are adding stuff to the database, altering it, deleting it, looking at it, all of those things, and it works, and it's pretty darn automatic, right? Saves us a ton of coding. And this is part of the power, once again, of this format, is that the simplicity, behind it, be it to be able to get to that point without writing a ton of code. However, right, here's the big however, you still have to understand what is happening to really utilize the tools most effectively. And there are nuances to it, but these are really basic. And this type of operation that we're doing right now is very common to a lot of app building. A lot of it is kind of done this way, right? You have some information, you put it in a table, it's retrieved later, you change it, you update it, you remove it, all that stuff, right? Pretty normal. And then you can use that to drive, whatever website or application you are building. All right, so that's that piece there. All right, next thing they're talking about here are strongly typed models and the app model directive. And it said earlier, we saw how the controller can pass data or objects to a view using the view data dictionary. The view data dictionary is a dynamic object that provides a convenient late bound way to pass information to a view. So MVC gives us the ability to pass that strongly typed model objects to a view. And this strongly typed approach enables compile time code checking. The scaffolding mechanism passed a strongly typed model in the movie controller class and views. All right. So it says examine the generated details method in the controllers. And if you look here at the method, right, and it says the ID parameter is generally passed as route data. For example, look at the URL here, right? So it's the controller, the method inside the controller, and then the ID number associated, right? So the movie's controller, details is basically which method or function we're using inside that controller, and then which data object it refers to, right? So like if we are looking for the details for that object, it's like, well, which controller do you need to go to? You go to the movie controller. Okay, what are you trying to do? I'm looking at the details of the movie, and which movie? Oh, the one with the ID number one, right? So it's all those little pieces, but the fact that it's built into the URL and that there's a logic go to it. You can also move it around, move data around basically by using kind of like a query string approach, right? And so I can trigger the details method and then feed to it the parameter that it's looking for, which is the ID. And notice the optional there once again. So like if it's not there, it's not going to crash. And they call that, when it's optional, they call that nullable type. If you want to, just in case you don't send it something, we don't want it crashing, right? So we're allowing it to be null. There's also a lambda expression here, and basically whenever you see like this kind of a equal greater than thing, that's what we call a lambda expression. And this basically like takes the query string that we take and then routes you based on the query string. And it says if a movie is found, an instance of the movie model is passed to the details view. So in other words, if we send it information either via a query string URL or a URL with slashes, right, like movies details one, it basically will retrieve the data from the database that matches up with that ID number, put it into a object in memory, and then that object in memory travels around the app and does the work, right? Right. So if a movie is found, an instance of the movie model is passed to the details view, right? And then that will send it back to the browser, right? So we can see the details. So then if you want to look at the views, you can look at under views, we have movies, right? And then details, and then it has how it displays on the screen, right? And then notice this is a mix of standard HTML, but it does have Razor syntax mixed in as well. So we played with this before. This is basically setting the title of the tab and the page. It shows us that we are using the model from the application, right? So which model are we using? Well, there's the movies model, right? We're not worried about other models yet. That's the only one we have, but we still need to call it basically to pull in the data. And then here where we're putting the data on the screen, notice that we have intermingled with regular HTML. So this is a definition list with the definition term and the definition data, so DTs and DDs. And what is it doing? It's dynamically pulling in, like in this case, the title, right? The release date, the genre, right? And notice that each one of these has two, because one is pulling back the term. So in other words, it's kind of like, what word in the dictionary you're looking up, and then this is the actual information. So, and that's why you're seeing it doubled up like that. So one defines the term, one just defines the actual information, and so for example, if I go to the details page, right, I have, the one part is the title, the other part is the actual title, right? That's basically what I'm referring to. says the model statement at the top of the view file specifies the type of object the view expects. So in other words, we're hoping that we get this movie model because that's the data we're using on this page, right? So, and it makes sense. So that's why that's added. So once again, they're kind of repeating the same thing that I did. As they kind of step through all the different things here. So for example, the model object is strongly typed. For example, in the detail CSHTML view, the code passes the movie field to display name for and display for, and these are helpers of the model. And then it says the create and edit methods also pass a movie object model. So we're still moving the same data object around when we're doing the editing. But what they're trying to point out is like this, you're pulling out display name for and then actually showing the name. It's kind of the thing I said before, I guess. It says examine the index.cshtml file and the index method in the movie's controller. And it says, notice how the code creates a list object when it calls the view method. Right? It's creating a list asynchronously here. The code passes the movies list from the index action to the view. Right? And this is a little bit of multi-threading going on there, right? We're waiting for it to respond before we put it back. The code returns problem details if the data context is null. So in other words, if it doesn't bring back something that we're looking for, it will send back an error message. This stuff was all created when we did the scaffolding, and notice what it does here. It adds also in the index.cshtml file, and let's just go there. This I enumerable thing, so we're creating basically an enumeration of the movies. So the movies are basically getting listed. As that's probably the best way I can say that, to enumerate something. The model directive allows access to the list of movies that the controller passed to the view by using a model object that's strongly typed. So for example, in the index CSHTML, the code loops through the movies with a for each statement over the strongly typed data model object or model object. So in other words, and once again, we saw this before, right? And they're showing you where it's happening here. It's not a matter of actually changing it, right? Because these calls are already present, right? So there's the for each. And really, once again, this is kind of the power of working with Razor. And if you want a comparison to like the Java world, like JSP is kind of similar to this, or even PHP is kind of similar to this because of that intermingling of HTML and coding language. And that's really why the Razor is cool. But this allows us to take a complex model, right? So for everything that is pulled back from the database, is what this is saying. We'll go through each movie, and then we'll pull the title, release date, and genre and price, and give you all the edit details and delete links for each object in the database, in that table, right? In that model, and it'll do that automatically. That's the for each loop. So if there's 2, it'll do 2. If there's none, it'll do none. If there's 1,000, it'll do 1,000. So that completes this particular page. And so we're going to move on now and work with the database a little bit more. So we're going to move on to the next section. And with this one, it says work with the database in an ASP.NET Core MVC app. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the stuff that we're using without necessarily altering it, but just kind of understanding more of what we're doing. I know that some of this is kind of repeat from the last app, but really this stuff is so important that repeating it a few times really doesn't hurt. Absolutely not. So here it says that the MVC movie context object handles the task of connecting to the database and mapping movie objects to the database records. Database context is registered with dependency injection. in the container in the program CS file. And now we already looked at that piece of code. If you remember, we looked at the builder services and the connection string piece. It also shows once again that there's a connection string in the app settings.json file. Once again, we've seen that that'll be unique for everybody, but that's important. When we're building an app the way that we're building, I think I mentioned this in several of the previous videos that we've done. If you're working on a personal computer, which most people are, or even on a development computer, chances are you are not running an instance of SQL Server, and I'm talking the full blown SQL Server on your local computer. It's not that you can't. It's not typical, right? You might do it to learn databases, but it's not something you necessarily need for a personal computer. And so what happens is when you're working inside a Visual Studio, it has an internal web server or internal SQL server called SQL Server Express that creates a local database inside the application itself. So it's like a little mini server, kind of the same way it's doing a web server when we're launching an app, so we can see it in the browser. And the little caveat I always tell people is if you do for some reason, either by virtue of having need to take a class where you installed SQL Server on your machine, or whatever, you're just that kind of person. If you have SQL Server running as an instance on your machine, Visual Studio will try to connect to that database, since it's like, why would I use an internal one when we have the real one right here? That's the thinking. So that could possibly happen, right? Typically, I recommend when you're doing development work to use the local database. What they want us to do next is to take a look at the database. So we want to go to the view menu, and we're basically going to tunnel in just like that. And we're going to look at the design of the movie table. This is basically identical to what we did with the other application. So I'm going to SQL Server Object Explorer under the tools menu that usually opens up in the left sidebar here, and you can see that it's there. If you want, you can pin it if that's helpful. I'm going to do that temporarily. You will notice that there's a couple of instances here, right? And I'm looking at the local database. So I'm going to expand that. And then we'll look at what databases are present inside of it. And right now we are using MVC movies. And let's see how theirs comes up here. So MVC movie context, right? So MVC movie context. Now, for those of you that have done the other tutorials, you noticing that your other databases are in there too, right? So those didn't go away. They're still there within the product. Okay, so we're going to expand that. And then inside there, we are then going to go to the tables. So we'll open up the tables, and then you'll see here, DBO movie. I'm going to right click that, and then I'm going to click on View Designer. And then what happens is it is loading up basically the structure of the table, right? So in the bottom part of the window here, you can see the code that you would basically run the SQL command. And notice this is T-SQL, which is Microsoft's version of SQL or SQL, whatever, which is slightly different than most other SQLs. It's got little things about it, but basically you can look at this if you know SQL code from any other database system and figure it out pretty darn quick, right? And if not, you could probably look up a couple of variances that are different. They're not really a lot of differences here. You notice that it does have that structure. If I wanted, I could come in here and actually tweak these things. I'm not going to, but I'm just looking at the moment. But it shows you the structure of the content, right? And that's what they're showing you here. The next thing they want us to do is actually right click again, and this time actually view the data. So if I right click that, I can actually look at what's inside the database, and you can see there that I have Star Wars and Toy Story. Notice the ID numbers, which are auto generating, right? And then this is direct access to the database, folks, right? So if I wanted to, I could directly inject data right here or change it, right? Most often, though, real frankly, if I'm building an application with a front end to manage content in the database, I'd rather kind of use the front end in most circumstances to tweak stuff rather than the back end. But if you've ever worked in any database product directly, and I'm thinking like SQL Server Management Studio or MySQL Workbench or something of, SQLite or something like that, Microsoft Access, if I didn't say that already, you can directly access the table and directly manipulate the data in the table if you wish, right? You can, and those tools are present here. But most of the time when I'm doing app building with Visual Studio, I'm just using Visual Studio to go, did the stuff make it in there? Oh yeah, look, it's there. Great. I'm happy, and then I move on. That's kind of the thinking on that. All right. So if you wanted, of course, you could add more information, and you could do all sorts of operations here. We are going to do the same thing we did in our previous app, once again, which is to seed some data into the database. And so they're giving us very specific instructions for doing this. This shouldn't be too hard to do. And it says, create a new class named seed data in the models folder and replace the generated code with the following. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So we're doing this in the models folder. So here's the models folder. We're going to do a right click, add new class file. We're supposed to call this seed data. Seed data, right? Maybe camel cased it. We're going to go ahead and add. Then we're going to take all of this code here. Just going to copy the whole darn page. And then I'm going to highlight all that and just replace it. And very quickly, just take a look at the code. Notice entity framework, MVC movie, the data. Well, there's also that link queue kind of abstraction language that is used in this environment. And then they have some other code here that allows us to basically not only structure the data, but also gives us data to directly enter into the database. Now, we have done this process before, right? And so notice what it's doing here. It's going to seed it with the, these four movies. All right, let's follow the next step. All right, and a special note here: if there are any movies in the database, the seed initializer returns, and no movies are added. Right. So, all right. So what is this telling us to do? All right. So it doesn't take a genius to figure this out. But if there is information already in the database, there's no point in seeding it. It's not going to let us do it. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to delete the records. And notice you're about to delete one row. It permanently deletes it, right? That's how databases work. There's no like undo command. And so I'm deleting both of those records, and now I have an empty database. So now I can go ahead and seed it and add that information. So let's do that process. All right. Now it says replace the contents of the program CS file with the following code. The new code is highlighted. So I'm going to take the approach of just adding the highlighted stuff. So let's add a using statement for MVC movie models. So I'm going to do a Control-C copy on that. And this is in the program CS file. Got to make sure I'm in the right file here. And so the MVC movie models. And then right under var app builder build, we're going to add this code. Copy that. Right. And notice how it's trying to auto suggest here. I'm not going to let it complete that. All right, so that will allow us to do the seeding. All right, now they say delete all the records in the database. One step ahead of you there. So, all right, you can do this with delete links in the browser or from SQL Server Object Explorer is what that stands for. So we did it from the Object Explorer. You know, we could have also done it from the front end of the app. So what I could do right now is I could just refresh this and say, yes, it's empty. Very good. All right. Next step. All right. It says test the app, force the app to initialize calling the code in program CS file so the seed method runs. To force the initialization, close the command prompt window that Visual Studio opened. This one, right? This weird one here. And then restart by pressing Control F5. So in other words, I'm going to stop the web server. I would suggest closing the tab also, right? That's me. And then we're going to do a Control F5. Right, so new instance running. So it's up, right? And then what is the next step? Okay, so now if I click on movies, is what it's telling me. So if I click here, I should see the seeded data. Toy Story and Star Wars went away, right? Can we make sure that it still works though? So if I want to add Star Wars back, right? Autofill, right? And we can see that that's working. I want to do an edit, maybe change the price a little, do that. Right, so all of it's still working. And we, in the process, we did a seed again. And this is where we're going to end for now. So this completes basically, the get started, add a controller, add a view, add a model, and work with the database. And then in the next video, I'm going to try to tackle the rest of the operations. And once again, some of these are very similar to what we did before, but this is a repetition thing to reinforce. And that will be in a separate video. So watch part 3 to get that stuff. Hopefully there won't be a part 4, but there will be a part 3. All right, so this video ends here. If you're not one of my students and you're watching this just because, make sure you subscribe to the channel and all that. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.